The hailstorm hit the Texas panhandle like God himself had grown tired of the land below and decided to punish it with ice and fury. And it was in the middle of that wild, howling chaos that Clara Baker first saw the silhouette of a rider cresting the low ridge that marked the eastern boundary of her property. She had been standing at the window of the ranch house, watching the sky turn from bruised purple to an ugly, churning green that she had learned over years of hard living meant nothing good was coming, when the figure appeared. He was just a shape at first, a dark smear against the pale violence of the storm, hunched low over the neck of a horse that was clearly miserable and clearly being pushed harder than it wanted to go. The hailstones were coming down the size of marbles now, clattering against the tin roof of the barn with a racket like buckshot, and Clara pressed her palm flat against the cold glass and watched the stranger come. She was 28 years old, and she had been alone on this land for 2 years. Not entirely alone, she had her foreman, a weathered and reliable man named Pete Gruder who slept in the bunkhouse with the 2 seasonal hands she kept on through the hardest months, but alone in the way that matters. Alone in the house. Alone at the table. Alone in the long evenings when the wind came off the flats and moaned through the gaps in the walls that her husband had always promised to patch and never had. Because her husband, Thomas Baker, had been dead since the spring of 1882, kicked by a horse in a way that seemed minor for 3 days, and then suddenly was not. It was 1884 now, and Clara had kept the Baker land through 2 brutal winters, a drought that cracked the earth like old pottery, and the quiet kind of heartbreak that nobody in town mentioned anymore because they had decided she was fine, and she had decided it was easier to let them think so. She pulled on her coat and her boots and she went to the door, because whatever else Clara Baker was, she was not the kind of woman who watched a man and his horse suffer in a hailstorm from the warm side of glass. She opened the door, and the storm came in at her like something personal, driving ice into her face and whipping her dark hair loose from its pin. She raised her arm against it and called out across the yard, her voice swallowed almost entirely by the wind and the clatter of hail, but the rider heard enough. He turned the horse toward her, and as he came closer, she could see him more clearly. He was tall in the saddle, even bent against the weather, with a dark hat pulled low and a coat that had seen better years. The horse beneath him was a deep bay, solid-looking, good bones, and Clara noticed the horse first the way she always noticed horses first, because they were the honest ones. The horse was scared and tired and leaning into the storm with grim determination, and Clara felt an immediate sympathy for it. The man pulled up short of the porch steps and looked down at her. He was somewhere in his early 30s, she thought, though the weather made it difficult to be certain. His face was angular and wind-burned, with dark eyes that were steady even in the chaos of the storm around them, and there was something in his expression that was careful rather than desperate, as though he had learned long ago not to show desperation even when he felt it. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was low and carried well despite the noise. "I saw the light. I apologize for riding onto your property without leave. I was looking for somewhere to wait out the storm. I would not trouble you for more than shelter for myself and my horse. I can sleep in the barn." Clara looked at him for a moment. She was not a foolish woman, and she had not survived 2 years alone on the Texas frontier by making careless decisions, but she had also not survived them by turning away a man in a hailstorm. There was something in the steadiness of his eyes and the care with which he had offered the barn rather than the house, the correctness of his ask, that settled something in her chest. "Get your horse into the barn," she said, "and then come inside. I have coffee on and you look like you could use some." Something moved in his face then, something brief and unguarded, before the careful expression came back. "Thank you, ma'am. That is very kind." She pointed him toward the barn and went back inside to check on the coffee pot, and she stood at the window again and watched him lead the bay into the barn with his own hands, walking beside the animal rather than dragging it, speaking to it in a low way that she could not hear but could see in the settling of the horse's ears. He was a man who was gentle with horses, she thought, and that told her something. He knocked on the door 7 minutes later. She had counted without meaning to. She opened it and he stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and his coat dripping and his dark hair plastered against his forehead, and he said, "I'm obliged to you, ma'am. My name is Clarence Langston." "Clara Baker," she said, and stepped back to let him in. "Come in before you catch your death." He wiped his boots on the mat with a thoroughness that suggested he had been taught manners by someone who cared about them, and he came inside, and Clara Baker closed the door on the storm. She poured him coffee and he sat at her kitchen table with his hands wrapped around the mug, and she noticed that his hands were scarred in the way of a man who worked outdoors, but there were also calluses on his right hand in a particular pattern that made her think of a man who had spent time with a pen as much as a rope. She filed it away without comment. "Where are you headed?" she asked, because it was the natural question and because she was curious. "West," he said. Then he seemed to think that was inadequate. "California, maybe. I haven't decided fully." "You're drifting," she said. It was not an accusation. Plenty of men drifted in 1884. The war had been over nearly 20 years, but it had left a wandering kind of restlessness in a certain type of man, and the frontier had always attracted those who needed to keep moving. He looked at her over the rim of the mug. "Yes, ma'am, I suppose I am." "Clara," she said. "Not ma'am, that's what people call my mother." Another brief movement in his face, nearly a smile. "Clara, then, thank you." The hailstorm howled and battered, and the tin roof of the barn rang like a bell and the windows shook in their frames. And Clarence Langston sat at Clara Baker's kitchen table and drank her coffee, and neither of them said much for a while. But it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that forms between people who are, without quite knowing it, already paying close attention to one another. Pete Gruder came in through the back door around supper time, shaking ice out of his hat and stomping his boots, and he stopped when he saw Clarence at the table and looked at Clara with the particular expression of a man who is protective but trying not to show it aggressively. "This is Clarence Langston," Clara said easily. "He rode in ahead of the storm. He's welcome here tonight." Pete looked at Clarence, and Clarence looked at Pete with a directness that was neither challenging nor submissive, and Pete made some private calculation and nodded. "Storm's getting worse," he told Clara. "I put the 2 horses in the south stall together and the calves are secured. We should be all right." "Thank you, Pete." Pete accepted his supper standing at the counter, in the way he always did when Clara had company, out of a respect for her that he never articulated but consistently demonstrated, and then he went back out to the bunkhouse, and Clara and Clarence were alone again. She made supper proper then because she had been going to cook anyway, beans and salt pork and cornbread because it was what she had, and she put it on the table and Clarence looked at it and then looked at her. "You don't have to feed me," he said. "I know I don't," she said and sat down. He ate with the controlled hunger of a man who had not been eating regularly and was trying not to show it, and Clara noticed and did not comment, but she put more cornbread on his plate and he did not refuse it. "How long have you been on the road?" she asked. He considered. "About 8 months this time." "This time," she repeated because those were the words that interested her. "I was in Kansas before, working a cattle operation. Before that, Missouri." "Before that," he paused and she saw him decide how much to say. "Before that I had something more fixed, but it fell apart and I left." "I'm sorry," Clara said. "Don't be." Some things fall apart because they were not right to begin with and you just couldn't see it while you were in the middle of them. He said it without self-pity, as a simple observation. Clara thought of Thomas, of the years she had loved him and the years that loving him had been more like managing him, and she understood what Clarence meant better than she might have expected. "Yes," she said, "that's true." The storm peaked around midnight and began to ease by 2 in the morning, but not enough for riding. And by then, Clara had long since shown Clarence to the spare room with the narrow bed and the quilt that had been her mother's. And she had gone to her own room and lain awake listening to the weather soften and thinking about his hands and the way he spoke to his horse and the careful steadiness of his dark eyes. In the morning, the world was white and still and glittering with the aftermath of the storm. Hailstones piled in the corners of the yard and along the base of the fence posts, and the sky had gone a clean, washed blue that only appeared after violence had spent itself. Clarence came to the kitchen early, and she was already up, as she always was, starting the fire and putting water on for coffee, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at her and said, "I was going to offer to help." "You can collect eggs," she said, nodding toward the coat hooks. "Coop is around the east side of the barn. Watch the brown hen, she's mean." He put on his coat and went out without further comment, and he came back 15 minutes later with 9 eggs in his hat and a scratch on the back of his right hand that was clearly from the brown hen. Clara pressed her lips together against a smile and took the eggs. "She warned you," she said. "Did," he agreed without complaint, and set his hat on the counter and washed his hands at the basin. They ate breakfast together, and the morning light came through the east window in long gold bars across the table, and Clara thought she could not remember the last time breakfast had felt companionable rather than solitary. "The storm has passed," he said, looking out the window. "I should get on the road." "The road is going to be a mess of mud and standing water for 2 days at minimum," Clara said. "Pushing a horse through that kind of ground does damage to their legs." Clarence looked at her. She looked back at him. "I wouldn't want to overstay," he said, and his voice was careful. "You would not be overstaying," Clara said. "You would be making a sensible decision about your horse." Something shifted in his expression, and it was the first time she had seen him look something close to uncertain. "Clara," he said, and then stopped. "The south fence took some damage in the storm," she said, turning back to the stove. "Pete will need help walking it. You're welcome to work for your board while the ground dries out." She felt him looking at the back of her head for a long moment. "All right," he said quietly. "Thank you." And so Clarence Langston stayed. He worked without being asked what to do next, which she appreciated, because she had known men who needed constant direction and found it exhausting. He walked the south fence with Pete, and they repaired 3 sections where posts had been heaved by the frozen ground and the ice weight had pulled the wire. He cleared the drainage ditch along the north side of the yard that had flooded and backed up against the foundation of the barn. He found, without being shown, that the hinges on the big barn door had been stiffening for a season, and he oiled them and rehung the door so it swung true. Pete came to Clara at the end of the second day with the particular expression she had learned to read as his most diplomatically neutral face. "That Langston works hard," he said. "Knows what he's doing." "He does," Clara agreed. Pete looked like he wanted to say more and decided against it, which was typical of Pete, and he went to the bunkhouse, and Clara went inside and found Clarence sitting at the kitchen table with a small ledger open in front of him. Not her ledger, his own, making notations with a short pencil. He looked up quickly and closed it. "Don't stop on my account," she said. He looked at the closed ledger. "It's just accounts. I keep track of what I earn and what I spend." "Old habit." "From?" she asked, a pause. "I worked as a bookkeeper for a time before I came west." Clara sat down across from him. The lamp was burning low and warm between them. "You don't strike me as a man who came west for adventure," she said. "No," he said. "I came west because east held nothing I wanted anymore." "What was in the east?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Then, a woman I was going to marry, a business I was building with her father." When she decided she preferred someone with more money and better connections, the business went with her, and the sense in staying went with the business. Clara said nothing. She watched him. "I'm not bitter about it," he said, and she could hear that he meant it, that whatever pain had been there had been processed into something quieter. "It was 5 years ago. I've had time to understand that we would not have been happy. She was the kind of woman who needs things I was never going to be able to provide, and I'm the kind of man who needs—" He paused. "Simplicity, I suppose. Honesty. Something real." Clara felt those words settle into her chest in a way that was slightly uncomfortable because she recognized them. "Thomas, my husband," she said, and his eyes came to hers quickly because she had not mentioned a husband, and she watched him recalibrate. "He died 2 years ago." He was a good man in many ways, charming and capable, and he loved this land. She smoothed a wrinkle in the tablecloth with 2 fingers. But there were things between us that were never quite right. Things I talked myself into because I thought love was supposed to be complicated and difficult. I understand now that I was confusing difficulty with depth. Clarence was very still across the table from her. "I'm not telling you that to make you feel sorry for me," she said. "I'm telling you because you were honest with me, and it seemed fair to be honest back." "You don't have to be fair to me," he said. "I'm a stranger eating your food." "You're not very much of a stranger anymore," Clara said, and then felt the color come into her face because it was more direct than she had intended. He looked at her for a moment with those dark, steady eyes, and then he said, very quietly, "No, I suppose I'm not." She went to bed shortly after that and lay awake again, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around her. And she thought that she was a 28-year-old woman who had been alone for 2 years, and she was going to have to be very careful about confusing gratitude for company with something more substantial. She gave herself that warning firmly and clearly, and then she thought about his voice and fell asleep. On the 3rd day the ground was still too soft for riding, but was beginning to firm, and Clarence went out with Pete at first light and came back at mid-morning leading 2 of the calves that had broken through a weak section of fence and wandered north. He had the calves on improvised rope leads and looked moderately covered in mud and not at all bothered by it. "North fence needs work too," he told Clara when he came to the kitchen to wash up. "I know," she said. "I've been meaning to get to it. Money's been tight for fence posts." He nodded, filing it away, and Clara was struck by the way he absorbed information about her situation without making her feel the exposure of having shared it. In the afternoon, while Pete worked on the calves' pen, Clara found herself standing in the barn doorway watching Clarence groom the bay, whose name she had learned was Asa, a name she found interesting and had asked about. "It was my grandfather's name," Clarence had said simply. "He gave me the horse when I left Missouri. He said a man should have something reliable under him when the world gets unreliable." "Your grandfather sounds like a wise man," Clara had said. "He was. He died last year, a beat. I miss him." The plainness of it, the lack of performance in the grief, had struck her deeply. Now she watched him work the brush along Asa's flank in long, steady strokes, and the horse leaned into it with a kind of blissful trust, and Clara thought that you could tell a very great deal about a person by the way animals responded to them. And she thought about what it meant that Asa leaned into Clarence Langston like he was the most trustworthy thing in the world. "Clara," he said without looking up because he had clearly been aware of her standing there for some time. "Sorry," she said. "Don't be. I don't mind the company." He moved around to the other side of Asa. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Why do you stay here, on this land? It's hard work for one woman, even with help. You could sell it, start somewhere easier." Clara was quiet for a moment. She came into the barn properly and leaned against the post. "My father broke this land," she said. "He came out here from Tennessee in 1861 when I was 5 years old because he had nothing there and he thought he could have something here. He was right. It was brutal and it nearly killed him twice, and he was right. He broke the first fields and built the first fence post himself, by hand, over 3 years. He gave this land to me when he died because my brothers had gone to the war and only one came back, and that one went to New Mexico." She looked out through the barn door at the white and brown and gold of the property, the low hills, the flat expanse, the sky that was enormous in a way that still moved her after all her years in it. "This land has my father's hands in it, his sweat and his hope and all his years. If I sell it, I'm selling that. I'm not willing to do that." Clarence had stopped grooming Asa. He was looking at her. "I understand that," he said. "Do you? My grandfather built the house in Missouri with the same kind of devotion," he said. "When I left it, I thought I was leaving freedom. Now I think I was leaving the only home I ever really had." He said it without self-pity, but there was something in his voice that sounded like a man who had only recently understood something about himself. "Maybe that's partly why I've been drifting, because I haven't found anything worth the same devotion." The words hung between them in the warm, hay-scented air of the barn. Clara said, more quietly than she intended, "I hope you find it." He looked at her, and the look was direct and soft at once, which was a combination she had not often seen on a man's face, and he said, "I'm beginning to think I might." She went back to the house and stood in the kitchen for a while without doing anything useful, just standing and feeling something shift in her chest like a door being pushed open that she had thought was stuck. That evening she asked him about California, what he planned to do there, and he admitted that he had no specific plan, that California was simply in the direction he had been pointing himself when the need to move overcame the need to think. He said it with a self-aware humor that she was beginning to recognize as a characteristic, the way he occasionally turned a precise and slightly rueful honesty on himself. "You could keep going," she said, "and see what you find." "Or," he said. She looked at him. "I didn't say or." "You had an or in your voice," he said, and his mouth curved, and it was the first time she had seen him smile fully, and it changed his face in a way that was not fair, she thought, because it was a very good smile. She felt herself smile back before she could prevent it. "The north fence," she said. "It needs substantial work. I need a reliable hand, and Pete is getting older. His back gives him trouble in the cold." "You're offering me a job," he said. "I'm telling you about my fence," she said, the smile again, slower this time. "I'll have a look at the north fence tomorrow," he said. "That would be helpful," she said, and turned back to the dishes, and behind her she could feel him still smiling. He looked at the north fence the following day and came back and sat down at the kitchen table and made a list, in his careful bookkeeper's hand, of what would be needed in materials and what he estimated the labor hours would be, and he pushed it across to her, and she looked at it and then looked at him. "You wrote this out for me," she said, "so you could make an informed decision," he said, "and compare it to what Pete would charge if he had to handle it alone with a bad back." Clara studied the list. The numbers were reasonable, more than reasonable, the kind of numbers a man wrote when he was not trying to take advantage. "This is fair," she said. "I try to be," he said, and then with a slight directness that was new, "I'd like to stay, Clara, if you'll have me, not just for the fence, for as long as I'm useful and as long as it suits both of us." She set the list down and looked at him carefully. In the 2 years since Thomas had died, she had become very good at reading the intentions behind what men said to her. Because a woman alone with land attracted a certain type of unwanted interest, and she had learned to watch for the difference between men who wanted her land and men who wanted her situation, and men who wanted her. Clarence Langston was looking at her with something she did not have a word for immediately, something that was not about the land and was not about the situation, something that was simply and directly about her, and it both unnerved her and settled her in a way she could not entirely explain. "As long as you're useful and as long as it suits both of us," she repeated. "That seems fair." He nodded, and the relief in his face was controlled but present, and she stored that away, the fact that he had wanted this and had cared about the outcome. So Clarence Langston stayed, and the storm was fully gone, and he did not go with it. The weeks that followed were ones that Clara thought about afterward as the slow building of something. The way you build a fire, not by throwing a flame at a log, but by starting with small things and adding larger things carefully, until you have something that sustains itself. They worked beside each other every day and talked over every meal, and gradually the careful distance they had maintained in the early days, the studied politenesses, began to give way to something more natural and more real. She learned things about him steadily. He was 32 years old, born in Missouri in 1852. The only son of a farmer and a schoolteacher who had both been devoted and both been gone before he was 25. His father to pneumonia and his mother to a grief that had simply one day decided it was done. His grandfather, Asa the Elder, had raised him for those last years and given him the horse named after himself, and sent him out into the world with a good education, good hands, and the advice that a man should never be ashamed of honest work or honest feeling. "He sounds as though he was remarkable," Clara said one evening. He was ordinary, Clarence said, in a way that made it clear he meant it as the highest praise. He was simply and completely himself, and he never once pretended to be something else. I've spent years trying to be half what he was. She learned that he could read and write well, that he had a genuine talent for figures, that he knew a great deal about cattle and horses from years of working with them, despite his bookkeeper's hands, and that he had a particular and quiet passion for the natural world that showed itself in small ways, in the way he noticed a hawk riding a thermal above the property, or would stop and look at the sunset over the flats with an attention that was almost reverent. He learned things about her, too. That she had been educated beyond what most people expected, because her father had been a schoolteacher's son himself and believed in reading, and that she had a small shelf of books in the parlor that she read and reread, and that she could discuss with a precision and feeling that surprised him and delighted him. That she was a better rancher than most men in the county because she had paid absolute attention her entire life and had a memory for what worked and what did not, that she deployed without sentiment. That she had a humor that was dry and quick and caught him off guard regularly, which she clearly enjoyed. And that she was lonely in a way she had made her peace with so thoroughly that she had almost stopped being able to feel the shape of it. He noticed the loneliness first, she thought, because he had his own version of it, and it takes a lonely person to recognize the particular texture of another person's loneliness. One evening in late October, about 6 weeks after the hailstorm, they were sitting on the porch after supper watching the last light go out of the sky, and Clara was telling him about the drought of the previous summer, how the creek had gone down to a trickle, and they had nearly lost the calves, and she had been sleeping badly and working from before dawn until after dark, and had cried in the barn one night because she was too proud to do it anywhere else. She had not meant to tell him that last part. It came out because she was tired and the evening was very peaceful and she trusted him, which was itself something she had not entirely acknowledged to herself until the words were already out. "I'm sorry," he said, and he said it simply, not with the elaborate sympathy that made her feel managed, just with the straightforward acknowledgement of one human being to another. "I'm all right now," she said. "I know you are," he said. "You're one of the most capable people I've ever encountered, and I have encountered a fair few." He paused. "It still matters that it was hard. Being capable doesn't mean it shouldn't have been acknowledged." Clara looked at the darkening sky. Her throat felt odd. "Thomas was not much for acknowledging hard things," she said. "He preferred to say they were fine. Everything was always fine." Clarence said nothing, just listened. "After a while you start to believe it yourself," she said. "Everything is fine. And then you realize one day that fine means nothing anymore, that you've filed everything under fine so long that you've lost the ability to distinguish between things that actually are fine and things that are not at all fine." "When did you realize?" he asked. She turned and looked at him. The porch lamp had come on, one of the hands had lit it, and it cast a warm, unsteady light across his face. "He died and I felt grief, and underneath the grief there was something that felt like breathing room," she said, "and I was ashamed of that for a very long time." Clarence looked at her steadily. "You don't have to be ashamed of it," he said. "I know that now," she said. "You were not glad he died," Clarence said. "You were sad, and you were also, in some part of yourself, relieved that a difficulty was over. Those two things can exist together. It doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you an honest one." Clara looked at him and felt the odd feeling in her throat again, sharper this time. "Clarence," she said. "Clara," he said. Neither of them said anything else for a moment, and then Clara turned back to the sky and the silence settled around them again. But it was different now, warmer and more charged, the silence of two people who have said something true to each other and are feeling the weight of it. He reached across and put his hand over hers on the arm of the chair. It was a simple gesture, brief, barely a moment, and he lifted his hand again before she could decide how to respond. But she felt the warmth of it through the rest of the evening, and she felt it still when she lay in bed. And she pressed her hand against her chest and thought, oh, carefully, oh. November came in gray and cold, and the work changed character with the season. The fencing was done, and Clarence turned his considerable organizational capacity to the winter preparation of the ranch, working with Pete and the other hands with an ease that came from genuine competence and a lack of ego that Clara recognized as rare. Pete, who was not a man given to enthusiasm, told her at the beginning of November that Langston was the best man he had worked beside in 20 years, and that was the entirety of his statement on the subject. But coming from Pete, it was equivalent to a written testimonial. Clara was in town the second week of November for supplies and was approached at the general store by Margaret Hollis, the wife of the biggest cattle rancher in the county, a woman of considerable social influence and considerable nosiness who wore them both with the same unconscious confidence. "I see you have a new hand at the Baker place," Margaret said, with the particular brightness of a woman delivering what she considers significant news. "I do," Clara said pleasantly. "A drifter, I'm told," Margaret said. "A very skilled hand," Clara said. "Clara, you know people will talk," Margaret said, leaning closer, dropping her voice to the register of concerned friendship. "People talk about everything, Margaret," Clara said, meeting her eyes calmly. "They talked when I kept the ranch after Thomas died, and they talked when I took on the seasonal hands, and they talked when I bought the new bull last spring. I've found that if I do what I believe to be right and I do it well, the talking eventually moves on to something else." Margaret looked at her for a moment with something that shifted from social concern to something more genuine, something closer to reluctant admiration. "You always were difficult to worry about properly," she said, and there was warmth under the exasperation. Clara smiled. "Buy a lot of things," she told the storekeeper and went about her business. But riding home with the wagon loaded, she thought about what Margaret had said, not because it frightened her, but because she had to be honest with herself about what was happening on her ranch. Clarence had been there nearly 2 months. She thought about him constantly. She looked forward to every meal and every conversation with an eagerness she had not felt in years. She noticed when he was not in her line of sight and felt settled when he was. She had been very careful not to examine those facts too closely, but sitting on the wagon seat with the November wind in her face and the horses picking their steady way home, she examined them. She was falling in love with Clarence Langston. She sat with that for the rest of the drive home, turning it over, checking it for truth the way she checked a fence line for weakness, looking for the places where it might be wishful thinking or loneliness speaking in love's voice. But it held up. It was not desperate or compensatory. It was the specific, particular, irreplaceable fact of him, his mind and his hands and his honesty and his quiet and the way he said her name. The question was what to do with that. She decided, with characteristic practicality, to do nothing yet, but to stop lying to herself about it. The following Sunday she invited him to church, which in the Texas Panhandle of 1884 was a social occasion as much as a spiritual one, and a public statement of a kind whether she meant it as one or not. He came without comment, dressed cleanly and carefully, and sat beside her in the pew, and she was acutely aware of every person in that small whitewashed church noting the fact and making their calculations. Afterward, the minister, a decent and unpretentious man named Reverend Glass, shook Clarence's hand and asked where he was from, and Clarence answered directly and asked the Reverend a question about the church's history in turn, which pleased the old man enormously, and Clara watched this and felt something warm and slightly proprietorial that she acknowledged to herself with a small internal humor. They drove home in the wagon and the afternoon was cold and still, and the land stretched away in every direction in its November colors, brown and gold and gray, enormous and austere and beautiful. "Thank you for taking me," Clarence said. "Thank you for coming," Clara said. A pause. The horse's hooves on the frozen ground. "Clara," he said. "Yes." "People noticed," he said, not accusatory, not presumptuous, simply factual. "I know they did," she said. Another pause. "Does that trouble you?" he asked. "I thought about it," she said. On the way back from town this week, I decided it doesn't. She felt him turn and look at her profile. Why not? Because what they're noticing, she said carefully, is not something I'm ashamed of. A long silence. Clara, he said, and his voice was lower. Don't say something you're not certain of, she said quietly. I am certain, he said. That's the thing I've been thinking about for weeks. I keep waiting to be uncertain, and it doesn't happen. He paused. I've been uncertain about a great many things in my life. I was uncertain about Missouri and uncertain about Kansas and uncertain about California. I have not been uncertain for a single day about whether I want to be where you are. Clara kept her eyes on the horses and the road, and she felt the truth of what he had said settle through her body like warmth. I've been running from things for a long time, he continued. Or toward things that turned out not to be worth running toward. I don't want to run anymore. I want to stay somewhere. I want to stay here, and I want that because of you, Clara, because of who you are. Not because of the land, not because I need somewhere to stop, but because there is no one I have ever known who I would rather sit across a table from for the rest of my life. Clara was quiet for a moment. The wagon rolled on. Then she said, That is a very fine thing to say. I mean every word of it, he said. I know you do, she said. That's what makes it fine. She let a beat go by. I feel the same, Clarence. I have felt the same for some weeks, and I have been being very sensible about it. Are you done being sensible? He asked, and she heard the smile in it. I am willing to be somewhat less sensible, she said. When they got back to the ranch and the horses were unhitched and put up, he walked her to the porch door in the gray afternoon light, and he took her hand and held it and looked at her, and he said, May I? In a way that left no uncertainty about what he was asking. Yes, she said. He kissed her, gently and fully, with none of the uncertain fumbling of a man who is surprised by his own feeling, and Clara felt the whole 6 weeks of careful restraint release itself in that moment, and she kissed him back, and the cold air was around them, and the light was going, and the horses in the barn were settled, and the land was still and vast and beautiful. And she thought, this is real. This is something real. They stood on the porch for a while after, her hand still in his, not talking much, looking out at the property in the fading light, and Clara felt the particular and specific happiness of a person who has found the right thing after a long time of making do with approximate things. Pete came around the corner of the barn, saw them, turned fully around, and went back the way he came with the decisive speed of a man who has correctly assessed a situation and made himself absent from it. And Clara laughed, and Clarence laughed, and it was the first time she had heard him laugh fully, open and warm, and it was, she thought, a very good sound. December came, and the ranch pulled inward for the winter in the way of all frontier places, contracting its activities, reducing its needs, centering itself on warmth and maintenance and survival. Clara and Clarence worked together in the cold days, and in the evenings they sat by the fire and she read aloud from the shelf in the parlor, which he loved, tilting his head and closing his eyes sometimes to listen, and he told her about the books his grandfather had kept and which ones he had read and which he regretted not reading. What do you regret not reading? She asked one evening. He thought about it seriously. Shakespeare, he said. My mother had a volume, but I was young and impatient, and I thought it was for older people. She died before I understood enough to want to go back to it. Clara went to the shelf and came back with the single volume of Shakespeare she owned, much worn, and put it in his hands. He looked at it and then at her, and something crossed his face that was so unguarded and so grateful that she had to look away for a moment. My mother gave that to me, she said. She was a great reader. I'll take care of it, he said. I know you will, she said. He read it slowly over the winter weeks, a few pages at a time, and occasionally he would look up and say something about what he had read, and she would respond, and they had long conversations about old plays and what they meant, and what they said about human nature that Clara found more stimulating than any conversation she had managed in years, and she was not a woman who had been starved for conversation. She had simply been waiting, without knowing it, for someone who thought at her particular pace and with her particular combination of practicality and feeling. In January, there was a blow-up with a neighboring rancher named Walt Grady, a large and aggressive man who had been pressing on the Baker land's eastern boundary for 2 years, moving fence posts incrementally, letting his cattle graze on Clara's grass without apology. Thomas had tolerated it, and Clara had managed it by being firm and consistent and legally correct, but Grady had tested her patience regularly and with increasing boldness since Thomas died. In January, Grady sent 2 of his hands onto Baker land to cut Clara's fence on the eastern boundary and push 50 head of Grady cattle through. It was a deliberate provocation, and Clara rode out to deal with it herself, which she had done before, with Pete at her side and a rifle across her saddle. But this time Clarence came too, on a sa, and he rode up beside her and said nothing and did not ask permission, and she thought that was exactly right. Grady was there in person, which was unusual and suggested he was emboldened by something, perhaps by the winter and the isolation and the belief that a woman alone would eventually break. "Baker," he said, not Mrs. Baker, because he was the kind of man who used discourtesy as dominance. "Thought it was time we settled this boundary question properly." "The boundary is settled," Clara said calmly. "It is where the survey says it is, as it has been since 1873, and your men will move your cattle back through the fence they cut before sundown today, or I will file with the county sheriff first thing tomorrow morning, and I promise you, Walt Grady, that a county judge is going to look at 11 years of survey records and 1 month of fence cuts and draw conclusions that are going to be expensive for you." Grady looked at Clarence, sizing him up, the way men do when they are deciding whether another man changes the equation. Clarence met his eyes without expression, easy in the saddle, his hands relaxed on the reins, a sass standing rock-steady beneath him. "Who's this?" Grady said. "This is my foreman," Clara said, because it was what he had become, and she had not had occasion to say it before now, and she saw Clarence absorb it without comment. Grady looked between them and made some calculation. He was a bully, which meant he was ultimately, like all bullies, a calculator of odds, and the odds today did not seem favorable, perhaps because of Clara's absolute composure or perhaps because of Clarence's particular quality of stillness that experienced men recognized as something to take seriously. "I'll move my cattle," Grady said, with a surly graciousness that was barely that. "But this ain't finished." "The boundary question is finished," Clara said. "The rest is up to you." She held his stare until he looked away, and then she waited while his hands turned the cattle and pushed them back through the cut fence, and then she turned her horse and rode back without watching Grady go, because she had won and she knew she had won and dignity did not require her to oversee his departure. Riding back, Clarence said, "You were magnificent." Clara laughed, which surprised her. "I was practical," she said. "The two are not mutually exclusive," he said. She looked sideways at him. "Thank you for being there." "I wasn't going to be anywhere else," he said simply. After that, Grady sent a formal letter through his own lawyer acknowledging the surveyed boundary, which Clara suspected was because someone, possibly his lawyer, had pointed out that he was in a weak legal position, and that the woman at the Baker ranch seemed to know it. She filed the letter carefully and noted with some satisfaction that the eastern fence was not touched again. In February, on a Sunday afternoon when the winter light was thin and silvery, and the fire in the parlor was particularly good, Clarence sat across from Clara and said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that your answer won't change how I feel about you or about being here." Clara put down her book and looked at him. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said, and his voice was quiet and direct, and he did not look away. "Not because of the ranch, not because it would be practical, though it would be, but because I love you. Because I have loved you since about 3 weeks after the hailstorm, and I have been a coward about saying so, and I am done being a coward." He paused. "You don't have to answer right now." Clara looked at him for a long moment. The fire popped and settled. The wind moved past the house outside. "Clarence," she said. "Clara, I am going to say yes," she said. "I want to be clear about that first so you can relax." A breath went out of him that told her more than any words could about how much he had been holding. "But I want to say some things before I say it formally," she continued. "This land is mine. I intend it to remain mine. I will not deed it away or put it under another name simply because of marriage. I want a partnership, a genuine one, where my decisions carry the same weight as yours on the things that matter to both of us. I have been married once and I spent that marriage accommodating rather than being accommodated, and I am not willing to do that again." "I would not want you to," he said. "I would be insulted on your behalf if you offered it." "Good," she said. "Is there more?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I want you to stay because you choose to stay, not because you have nowhere else to go, not because leaving would be complicated or difficult, because this is where you want to be." "This is where I want to be," he said without hesitation. "I know," she said. "I believe you. I'm saying it so it's said so we both know it's been said and agreed to." "I understand," he said. "All right," she said. "Then yes. Yes, I will marry you, Clarence Langston." He stood and came to her and took both her hands and held them, and he looked at her with an expression of such complete and concentrated feeling that Clara felt her throat tighten, and he said, "I have never been more certain of anything in my life." "Neither have I," she said, which was true and which meant something, because she had been uncertain of Thomas from the beginning in ways she had refused to examine. They were married in April of 1885, in the same small whitewashed church where she had taken him in November, by Reverend Glass, who was clearly delighted by the whole affair, and gave a sermon that was entirely too long and entirely sincere. Pete Gruder stood up for Clarence, because the two of them had developed the slow and undemonstrative friendship of men who respect each other's competence, and Margaret Hollies, who had reversed her initial skepticism completely, and arrived at a warm enthusiasm that she expressed by organizing the wedding supper with unnecessary but deeply appreciated energy, stood beside Clara. Clara wore her best dress, a dark blue wool that was perhaps not conventional wedding attire but was practical and was hers, and she wore her hair up with 2 pins that had been her mother's, and Clarence wore a suit that he had quietly and without fanfare purchased in town the week before, dark and well-fitted, and when she came down the aisle of the little church and saw him standing there watching her with that look on his face, the particular steady warmth of it, she felt something settle in her. Deep and final, something that had been unsettled for years. "You are the most beautiful person I have ever seen," he told her quietly, before Reverend Glass began, and she thought he might be being generous about the beautiful part, but she did not think he was being anything but absolute in his sincerity. The summer of 1885 was a good one, the best the Baker Ranch had seen in several years. The rains came at the right times, and the grass was thick, and Clarence had an idea for rotating the cattle pasture that improved the grazing capacity, which he had arrived at from reading and from observation, and which Pete had adopted with the air of a man who knows a good idea when he sees one. They brought in 2 new calves in the spring and sold 4 head at the late summer market for a better price than Clara had managed in 2 years, and the money went into new fence posts for the north and east boundaries, and a new water tank that Clarence had been advocating for since the previous fall. They worked hard and they worked together, and in the evenings they were still the companionable people they had been from the beginning, still talking over supper with the same quality of attention to each other, still reading by the fire, still finding things to be curious about together. What was different, what was new and particular and entirely its own thing, was the life behind the closed door of their bedroom, the private country of their marriage, which was tender and honest and warm in ways that Clara had not expected because her experience of intimacy had been of something adequate and unremarkable. With Clarence it was something else entirely, something that had to do with the particular fact of each of them, with being genuinely known by the person you were with. And Clara understood, for the first time fully, what it meant to be loved by someone who saw you clearly and loved what they saw. In the fall, Clara knew She was expecting their first child, and she told Clarence on a Tuesday evening when he came in from the fields, telling him directly across the kitchen table before she had even taken off her apron, because she was too moved to manage any sort of gradual revelation. The expression on his face was one she would remember for the rest of her life. Pure and complete astonishment that moved into something so deep it almost frightened her. And then he was standing and he had taken her hands and he held them against his chest and pressed his forehead against hers, and they stood like that for a long time in the kitchen with the smell of the supper starting to burn on the stove and neither of them moving to address it. "A baby," he said, as though confirming it to himself. "A baby," she confirmed. He lifted his head and looked at her, and his eyes were bright, and she had never seen him look so undone, and it made her love him so fiercely that she had to press her lips together. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "A little," she said. "Are you?" "Terrified," he said promptly, and then smiled that full warm smile. "And very, very glad." "So am I," she said, "on both counts." She burned the supper, and he did not mind in the least, and they ate bread and cold beans and talked about everything, all the things to be done and thought about and planned for, and Clarence was practical and excited in equal measure, which was entirely characteristic of him, and Clara thought that of all the things she had decided in her life, saying yes to that Hailstorm stranger had been by a very wide margin the best of them. The winter of 1885 into 1886 was a hard one, the kind of winter the Texas Panhandle occasionally produced that reminded you it was a serious place, with a cold that came in December and stayed deep and mean through February, and a pair of blizzards that kept them in the house for days at a time. Clara was heavy with the baby by January, and the cold in her bones was something she endured with her usual practicality, though she allowed herself more rest than she normally would have, which Clarence both insisted upon and enforced with a gentle firmness that she found equal parts touching and amusing. They had long days in the house during the blizzards, Pete and the hands managing the essential outdoor work while Clara and Clarence were inside, and they played cards and she read aloud and he fixed things around the house that had needed fixing, the gaps in the walls that Thomas had never gotten to, the hinges in the kitchen, the floorboard in the parlor that had been uneven for years. And Clara watched him work with the focused contentment of a man who is happy in his circumstances and felt a gratitude so large it sometimes took her breath away. "What are you thinking?" he asked once, catching her watching him. "That I am very lucky," she said. "I am the lucky one," he said. "We can both be lucky," she said. "It's not a competition." The baby was born in February in the middle of a hard, cold spell, attended by the county's doctor, a capable and unflappable woman named Dr. Maria Salinas, who had been practicing in the Panhandle for 15 years and whom Clara trusted entirely. The birth was difficult, longer than anyone wanted, and Clara was exhausted and in considerable pain for several hours, and Clarence sat beside her the entire time and held her hand and spoke to her quietly, and did not once tell her everything was fine, which she had specifically requested he not do, and which he honored. "Tell me true," she said at one point during a difficult stretch, her hand gripping his so hard she could feel his bones. "You're doing well," he said. "Dr. Salinas says so and I believe her. It's hard and it hurts and you're doing it." "Good," she gritted out. "That's what I need to hear." At last, in the cold February morning, the baby arrived, healthy and loud, and Dr. Salinas placed him in Clara's arms with the satisfied expression of someone who has done their job well. "A boy," Clara said, looking at the red and furious and absolutely beautiful face of her son. "A boy," Clarence said beside her, his voice entirely without his usual control, scraped raw with wonder. "Hello, you." They named him Asa Thomas Langston, for Clarence's grandfather and for Thomas Baker, because Clara thought the land deserved a connection to the man who had come before, even if that man had not been everything he might have been. Asa Thomas, which Pete immediately shortened to AT, which stuck. AT was a baby of strong opinions and considerable lung capacity, and Clara managed him with the same competent practicality she brought to everything. And Clarence proved himself a man who was not afraid of an infant, who picked up AT with the same confidence he did everything, and walked him through the cold nights when the baby would not settle and sang to him quietly old songs Clara did not recognize, which she thought might be songs his mother had sung, and which touched her enormously. Spring came and the ranch came back to life, and AT was propped in the sun on the porch in the afternoons while Clara and Clarence worked nearby. And Pete, who had been gruff and unmoved by most things in his life, was completely undone by the baby and could be found making extraordinary faces at him with no provocation. The year turned, and the year after that turned. The Baker Ranch, which had been on uncertain footing for 2 years after Thomas died, became something solidly good, a place that worked, that was properly maintained and properly run, that produced enough and grew carefully. Clarence's bookkeeping skills proved valuable beyond the ranch itself, and he began in a quiet way to help neighboring ranchers and the local business owners with their accounts, a service that was needed in a county where formal financial help was scarce, and which brought in a supplementary income that allowed Clara to put money away against the hard years that the frontier always eventually produced. Clara became pregnant again in the spring of 1888, which she announced to Clarence with a calm that was slightly belied by the brightness of her eyes, and he took her face in both his hands and kissed her forehead and said, "Are we doing well?" "We are doing very well," she said. "Then I am glad," he said. The second baby was a girl, born in winter again, which seemed to be their children's preference, and they named her Eliza Grace, for Clarence's mother whose name was Elizabeth, and for Clara's mother whose middle name had been Grace. Eliza was smaller than AT had been but louder, which no one had imagined possible, and she had Clara's dark hair and Clarence's steady dark eyes, and was, from the first, absolutely certain that the world was arranged entirely for her convenience. AT, who was 2 years old and had thus far been the unchallenged center of the universe, regarded his sister with the concentrated suspicion of a property owner observing a new development on an adjacent lot. "He'll come around," Pete said, watching AT watch the baby. "He will," Clarence said. "He's curious. Look at his face." And indeed AT was not so much hostile as deeply interested, and within 2 weeks he had appointed himself Eliza's protector and guardian in the particular way of a toddler, which mainly involved standing between her and anything he deemed a threat, including the cat, Pete, and several pieces of furniture. Clara watched her children and her husband and her land, and she thought, on a spring evening in 1889, sitting on the porch where she had first kissed Clarence, that she could not have imagined this when she stood at the window watching a dark shape ride through the hailstorm 4.5 years ago. She could not have imagined the particular warmth and fullness of the life she was living, the specific and irreplaceable fact of him beside her, the sound of AT's boots on the porch boards and Eliza's voice from inside, the way the land looked in the late light, golden and enormous. Clarence came out and stood beside her and looked at the same view and said, "What are you thinking?" "About the hailstorm," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Me too, sometimes." "What do you think about when you think about it?" "That I almost didn't stop," he said. "I saw the house and I thought, no, push on, don't impose, find a barn or wait it out in a gully. And then I thought, that is a sensible house with light in the window, and you are going to be very foolish if you ride past a sensible house with light in the window in a hailstorm." He paused. "And then I thought, I'll just ask. Just ask, and if she says no, I'll move on. And I rode up the hill and I knocked and you came to the door and you looked at me like you were deciding something important." "I was," she said. "What were you deciding?" "Whether you were the kind of man I could trust to say yes to," she said. He turned and looked at her. "What made you say yes?" "Your horse," she said. "The way you were with your horse in the storm, the way you were trying to protect it. A man who is genuinely careful with a frightened horse in a crisis is telling you something about his character that his words can't." Clarence looked at her for a moment, and then he laughed, his full warm laugh, and she laughed with him, and the evening was around them vast and calm. "You judged me by my horse," he said. "I judged you by your horse," she confirmed. "And I was right." "You were right," he said. He sat down beside her, and she leaned against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they watched the light go down over the Baker land, over the fences and the fields and the barn that had his labor in it now as much as anyone's. And the sky turned the colors that the Texas sky did when it was in a generous mood, orange and pink, and a deep luminous gold. And from inside the house, there was the sound of Pete playing some kind of game with the children that involved significantly more running than Pete's back appreciated, judging by his periodic yelps of protest. "Pete's going to put his back out again," Clarence observed. "He will not stop doing it, though," Clara said. "No," Clarence said. "He won't." A comfortable silence. "Clarence," she said. "Clara, are you happy?" He was quiet, the considering quiet she knew and loved, the one that meant he was going to answer honestly rather than quickly. "I'm happier than I knew it was possible to be," he said. "I don't say that easily. I am not an easy man for happiness. I tend toward the careful and the cautious, and I spent years being neither miserable nor glad, just moving. I didn't understand what I was missing because I had never had it. But yes, I am happy. I am very happy." He pressed his lips to her temple. "Because of you, because of this. Because of A.T. and Eliza and Pete's complaints about his back and the north fence and the brown hen that still hates me." "She hates everyone," Clara said. "She hates me personally," he said with dignity. Clara laughed and turned and looked at him, at the face she knew better than any face in the world, the angular planes of it and the dark eyes and the way he looked at her, always with that particular quality of attention, the attention of a man who is completely present with the person in front of him. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you since about 3 weeks after the hailstorm, and I will love you until I don't have enough breath left to say so." She kissed him there on the porch in the evening light, the same porch where he had first kissed her, and it was different now from that first kiss. It was deeper and quieter and more sure, the kiss of people who have built something together and know the weight and the worth of it. The year rolled on, and the ranch continued to grow, and the children grew with it, A.T. becoming a serious and observant boy who had his mother's memory and his father's deliberateness, and who by the age of 4 was following Pete around asking questions that Pete answered with a gruffness that hid genuine delight. Eliza was a force of nature, loud and curious and absolutely fearless, who by the time she could walk steadily had discovered that the animals on the ranch were hers to befriend on her own terms, including the brown hen, who submitted to Eliza with a baffled compliance that the hen had shown to no other living being. "That hen has surrendered to your daughter," Clarence said, watching Eliza carry the hen around the yard. "She recognized a stronger will," Clara said. Pete started having real trouble with his back in the fall of 1889, bad enough that Clara sat down with him seriously and talked about what he could and could not continue doing, and what she wanted, she told him, was for him to stay on as a senior advisor and to scale back the physical labor to what he could manage comfortably. Pete resisted this for several weeks on principle, and then accepted it with the grace of a man who is relieved but will not say so. They hired a new hand that fall, a young man named James Webb, 20 years old, who came from a farm family and knew cattle and was honest and worked without complaint, and had the slight wonder of a young person who has landed somewhere better than they expected. Clara and Clarence trained him up over the winter, and by spring he was solid and reliable, and Pete had adopted him with the particular warmth Pete reserved for people he would never compliment directly. There was one difficult period in the winter of 1889 into 1890, when a fever moved through the county and struck A.T. badly enough that Clara spent 3 nights beside his bed with Dr. Salinas and with Clarence, all 3 of them watching the small boy fight it, and Clara experienced the particular terror of a mother whose child is ill that is unlike any other terror she had known, a fear so sharp and physical it was almost like a thing with edges. Clarence stayed beside her through all 3 nights, not sleeping, talking to A.T. in the low, quiet voice he used with frightened horses. And when A.T.'s fever broke on the 4th morning and he looked up at his parents with exhausted but clear eyes and said, "I'm hungry," Clara burst into tears with a completeness and a relief that shook her whole body, and Clarence held her and let her shake. "He's all right," he said into her hair over and over. "He's all right. I know," she said. "I know he is. I just needed to do this." "I know," he said. "Take all the time you need." A.T. recovered fully and was running Pete ragged again within 2 weeks, and life resumed. But the 3 nights of vigil left Clara with a new and clarified knowledge of what Clarence was to her. Not just husband and partner and the person she wanted at the table, but the person she wanted beside her in the worst of it. The person whose presence made the unbearable bearable by the simple fact of his being there, steady and real, and entirely without pretense. She told him so on a quiet evening after A.T. was recovered and the crisis had fully passed. "You were there," she said, "those 3 nights." "Of course I was," he said. "I know," she said. "I just want to say it. Thomas would have helped, I think, but he would have needed me to be the steady one. He would have needed managing along with A.T. You did not need managing. You were simply there." Clarence was quiet. "That is what I mean when I say I love you," she said. "Not just the good evenings on the porch, the 3 nights by the bed." "Those 3 nights were the most frightening of my life," he said. "I know they were," she said, "and you were steady through all of them." "Because you needed me to be," he said simply, "and because A.T. needed me to be, and because I was afraid and being steady was better than not being steady." "That is what love looks like," Clara said. "Not just the feeling, the choosing." He looked at her with that unguarded quality she had learned to treasure, the moments when the careful steadiness dropped and she could see all the way through to the man underneath, the man who had come through loss and wandering and found his way to her porch in a hailstorm. "Yes," he said, "exactly that." The spring of 1890 brought good rains again, and the ranch prospered, and Clara discovered in April that there was a 3rd child coming, which she and Clarence received with a joy that was deeper and quieter than the joy of the first 2 announcements, the joy of people who know exactly what they are receiving and value it all the more for knowing. "Are you well?" he asked. "I am very well," she said. "And glad. Profoundly glad," she said. The 3rd child was a boy, born in November of 1890, healthy and peaceful, which was a relief after Eliza's entrance into the world, which had been conducted at full volume. They named him Henry Robert, for no one in particular, just names they had both always liked, and which seemed to fit the quiet baby who looked at the world with a contemplative expression that Pete claimed he got from Clarence, and Clara said, was simply because he was cold. A.T., now 4, was enormously proprietorial about both his younger siblings and could be found dispensing information to them at all times regardless of their ability to receive it. Eliza, now 2, regarded Henry with cautious approval and occasionally patted his head with a firmness that made Clara watchful. "She's gentle," Clarence said. "She's Eliza," Clara said. "She's roughly gentle." "He seems unbothered," Clarence observed, looking at Henry, who was indeed regarding his sister's rough patting with the same equanimity he brought to everything. Pete, whose back had improved somewhat through the lighter workload, held Henry with the careful reverence of a man who had decided some things were simply to be cherished without question, and bounced him gently and looked at Clara and said, "That's a fine boy," as though he was announcing something important. "Thank you, Pete," Clara said seriously. The 1890s came in and the Baker Ranch settled into what it had always been meant to be, Clara thought, what her father had intended when he broke the first fields with his own hands, a place that was alive and purposeful and connected to the people who worked it. It was not the biggest operation in the county. It was not the most profitable, but it was managed with intelligence and care and genuine love. And it showed in everything from the condition of the fences to the health of the cattle, to the fact that Pete had been there for over a decade and James Webb had been there for 2 years and showed no signs of leaving. Clara was 34 now, and Clarence was 38, and they had been married 5 years. And she thought that 5 years of a good marriage was better than 20 of an approximate one, and that she had been given something rare, and she knew it. On a clear September morning in 1892, Clarence came to her with his ledger and sat across from her at the kitchen table, and she recognized the expression he wore when he had been thinking carefully about something and was ready to present it. "I've been looking at the accounts," he said. "I know you have," she said. "You've been at them all week. We're in a position," he said, "to make some improvements, significant ones. The water system first. A proper well and pump for the north pasture, which would improve the grazing capacity considerably. And the barn could be extended to take 6 more head through the winter, which would let us expand the herd without the risk of overwintering losses." She looked at the numbers he had written out. They were careful and accurate, as his numbers always were. "That's the conservative option," she said. "There's a more ambitious one," he said, with a slight smile, because she always saw it. "Tell me." "Buy the Hendricks parcel," he said. "Jim Hendricks is selling, I heard it in town. The eastern parcel, the one that runs along the creek. 40 acres. Good water and good grass. It would double our creek frontage." Clara looked at him. "That's significant money." "It is," he said, "but the timing is good, and I believe the price will be fair. And in 10 years, 15 years, when A.T. or Henry or Eliza or all 3 of them are running this land, they will thank the decision." Clara sat with it. She looked at the numbers, and she looked at the window, and she looked at Clarence. "You think ahead," she said. "I think ahead," he confirmed. "I spent years not thinking ahead. I prefer this." She thought about her father breaking the land with his own hands, thinking ahead for her, for all of them. She thought about what it meant to grow something with intention. She thought about A.T., 6 years old and already intensely devoted to the ranch, asking Clarence serious questions about cattle rotation that Clarence answered as though A.T. were a colleague. "Buy the Hendricks parcel," she said, "and do the well and the barn extension." Clarence looked at her, and his eyes were warm. "Are you certain?" "I am," she said. "This is ours, Clarence, ours and the children's. We build it while we can." He covered her hand with his on the table and squeezed once, and she turned her hand under his and held it. They bought the Hendricks parcel in October of 1892, and the well was drilled in the spring, and the barn extension was completed by summer, and the Baker Ranch in the summer of 1893 was a different thing from what it had been in the Hailstorm October of 1884, when a drifter on a bay horse had come over the eastern ridge and asked a widow to wait out the storm. The injustices of the time were not absent from their lives. Clara was aware, as a woman who owned and operated land, that she existed in a legal and social system that had not been designed for her, and that resisted her at various points. The property was legally in her name, but the conversations in town often addressed themselves to Clarence on ranch business before reaching her, and she had developed a calm and precise way of redirecting those conversations that Clarence supported with a consistency she valued enormously, never speaking over her, never accepting address that should have come to her first. They were also aware of what the frontier meant to the people who had been on the land before any of them, the Comanche and the Kiowa, whose territory the Panhandle had been, and whose presence had been violently ended over the course of the previous 2 decades, in ways that neither Clara nor Clarence discussed as abstractions. Clarence had been present in Kansas during some of those years, and had seen things that had left their mark on him, and he spoke of them with a directness that Clara found important, because it would have been easy, in 1884 Texas, to simply not speak of them at all. "My grandfather said the land remembers," Clarence told her once, "even when the people on it have decided to forget." "He was right," Clara said. "I think my father felt it too, though he didn't have your grandfather's way of saying things." "Your father built something good here," Clarence said. "We are building something good here," Clara said, and leaned her head against his shoulder. The years moved through the 1890s, and the children grew, at becoming more and more his father's son in temperament, while remaining entirely his own person. a serious and capable boy who had a particular gift with the cattle and who had Pete's complete devotion. Eliza grew into herself with a force and a confidence that astonished and delighted her parents in equal measure, attending the county school with a ferocity that alarmed some of her teachers and impressed others, and declaring at age 7 that she intended to be a doctor, an announcement that was received by her parents with complete seriousness. Henry was quieter, more like Clara in some ways, watchful and precise, with a gift for plants and growing things that had expressed itself at age 4 when he planted beans in the kitchen garden, and tended them with an intensity that was almost comical and entirely moving. Pete's back eventually decided it was done with serious work in 1894, and he retired to a chair on the porch with a dignity that Clara and Clarence maintained by continuing to ask his opinion on everything, and following enough of his advice that he never felt superfluous. James Webb had by then become the effective foreman, steady and solid, and had brought on a young hand named Cole Reed who was 19 and eager, and reminded Clara somewhat of herself at that age, which was to say intelligent and slightly impatient, and capable of more than most people would assume. On an evening in the fall of 1895, 11 years after the hailstorm, Clara and Clarence were sitting on the porch where they always sat in the evenings when the weather allowed, the porch that had become their particular country, and the light was going down over the Baker land, over all of it, the original land and the Hendricks parcel, and the new fencing, and the extended barn, and the north well, and the fields that were resting for winter. A.T., 9 years old, came out and leaned against the railing and looked at the sunset with the same contemplative expression his father wore, and then said, "Pa, do you think it'll frost tonight?" "I do," Clarence said. "The temperature dropped fast this afternoon and the sky was clear. Better put another blanket on Rosamund." Rosamund was A.T.'s horse, a gift for his 7th birthday, a gentle roan mare, and A.T. took her welfare with absolute seriousness. "Yes, sir," A.T. said and went back inside to get his coat. Eliza appeared in the doorway behind him. "He's going to the barn," she announced. "We know," Clara said. "Can I go too?" "Yes," Clara said, "but be back before the light goes entirely." "I will," Eliza said, and was already gone. Clara listened to the sound of their boots on the yard and the creak of the barn door and then silence, and the evening was around her, vast and still. Henry appeared in the doorway, small and deliberate, and came to sit between them on the porch step, which was his preferred position, and leaned back against Clara's legs with the unself-conscious ease of a small child who has never had reason to doubt his welcome. Clarence looked at her over Henry's head, and she looked back at him, and the look between them was complete and full of everything, all 11 years of it and all the years still to come. She reached across Henry and took Clarence's hand. "The porch needs new boards on the west side," she said. "I know," he said. "I'll get to it next week. You said that last month." "I meant it both times," he said, and the smile was in his voice. Henry looked up at them both with his serious face. "Are you talking about the porch or are you not really talking about the porch?" he asked. Clara and Clarence looked at each other. "Both," Clarence said. Henry seemed to find this satisfactory and looked back at the sunset with his contemplative expression. The light went the colors that only the Texas sky produced, the orange deepening into something like fire, the gold at the horizon going long and slow, the blue overhead deepening toward the color of a good, clean winter night. And Clara sat on the porch of the home her father had built and her husband had repaired and her children had filled, and she felt the particular happiness that does not announce itself loudly, but is simply and completely present. The happiness that is built from 1,000 ordinary things, from coffee in the morning and the sound of boots on boards, and a hand that knows your hand, from the north fence repaired and the calves secured and the storm waited out, from a yes said to a stranger on a rainy night that turned out to be the best yes of her life. Asa, old now and slower but still sturdy, was in the barn with Rosamund and A.T., and he would live another 2 years and die peacefully in the spring of 1897. And Clarence would take it quietly, and with a grief that Clara understood was layered. And she would stay beside him that day the way he had stayed beside A.T.'s bed, simply and completely present. And they would bury the horse in the field by the old fence line where he had liked to stand in the afternoons and feel the sun. But on this evening, he was in the barn being fussed over by A.T., and Pete was in the bunkhouse with his feet up, and James was checking the south pasture one last time before dark, and Eliza was coming back from the barn with a strand of hay in her hair, running because she always ran, and Henry was leaning against his mother's legs looking at the sunset with his father's eyes, and Clarence Langston was holding Clara Baker's hand on the porch of the land that her father had built and they had grown together. And the storm had passed 11 years ago and he had not gone with it, and Clara thought that was the most important fact of her life, more important than any other, the fact that she had opened the door against the hail and the fury and said yes, and that he had stayed. He would always stay. The last light went gold and then amber, and then the deep soft dark of a Texas fall evening, and the family moved inside, and the lamps came on in the windows, warm against the night, a light that could be seen from the ridge above the property, from the road that ran east to west across the flats, the same road he had ridden in from 11 years ago when the hailstones had been the size of marbles, and the sky was an ugly churning green. Anyone who had ridden past on that road in the fall evening of 1895 and looked up at the Baker Ranch house would have seen those lit windows and would have thought, that is a house with people in it who are glad to be there, the kind of gladness that takes years to build, and that holds together through frost and fever and difficult neighbors and the long hard work of a frontier life, the kind that does not announce itself but simply is, steady and warm and real, which was exactly what it was. Which was exactly what Clara Baker and Clarence Langston had made of a hailstorm and a porch light, and a yes that had changed everything, not dramatically, not all at once, but the way the best things change you, slowly and thoroughly and all the way down, until you cannot remember with any accuracy what you were before, and you find you have no desire to try.